Up until the end of the 18th century, the world was, for the most part, dominated by European monarchies. Their colonies were springing up like mushrooms everywhere. But this state of affairs was about to receive a major blow when 13 colonies of British America decided to renounce their king. Today, we are going to talk about the independence of the American colonies and the birth of the United States. Hello, and welcome to 7 Facts. The American Revolutionary War was a not very surprising outcome of the disputes between Great Britain and its American colonies. Throughout the 1700s, the settlers of America became increasingly frustrated at their European leaders, who were imposing taxes on them. From their founding, these colonies were pretty much left to govern themselves, but owed contribution to the national budget, without actually having a proper representation in the parliament. Between 1754 and 1763, the French and Indian War was fought, which pitted the British colonies against those of France. That war was won, and the French ceded the vast majority of New France, including Canada, but this victory came at a cost. This was a very expensive war that was actually part of the even larger and more expensive 7 Years' War, so the British government was now deeply indebted. So London started imposing taxes on its colonies. The Stamp Act of 1765 required Americans to only use stamped paper produced in London, which carried an embossed revenue stamp. This was the act that spawned the now famous slogan, "No taxation without representation." The Townshend Acts were another series of tax-imposing laws that were even more heavily opposed. Things like glass, lead, paint, and tea were now supplementally taxed and had to be imported from Britain. This led to the Boston Massacre of 1770, when British soldiers who were being harassed opened fire and killed several protesters. In 1773, the famous Boston Tea Party happened. The British East India Company was exempted from paying local taxes and only had to pay the Townshend taxes. In protest, demonstrators boarded the ships and threw the chests of tea into the Boston harbor. London responded harshly by adopting the so-called Intolerable Act, which, among other provisions, ended local self-government in Massachusetts and closed Boston's commerce. Colonists of the 13 colonies in turn responded to these laws with even more protests and by convening the First Continental Congress, which petitioned the British monarch for repeal of the act. He didn't. The crisis escalated, and the American Revolutionary War began near Boston in 1775. The first shots of the war were fired on April 19, 1775. Sir Thomas Gage, the commander-in-chief of British troops in North America, wanted to seize and destroy illegal stores of militia ordnance at Concord near Boston in Massachusetts. He also intended to capture John Hancock and Samuel Adams, two of the leading instigators of the rebellion. However, the militia learned of Gage's intentions and alerted the Concord militia. It is not clear who shot first, but that came to be known as the shot heard round the world. It was the beginning of a full-scale battle in Lexington and Concord. After suffering some 300 casualties, British troops withdrew to Boston, followed by the militia who laid siege to the city. Over the next month, 4,500 British reinforcements arrived. In the following Battle of Bunker Hill, over 1,000 British soldiers died in a disastrous frontal assault. This was no longer a local revolt, it was a full-scale war that was about to engulf all 13 colonies. On June 14th, the Continental Congress decided to officially assume command of the forces in Boston. This was the birth of the Continental Army. This new army needed a commander-in-chief, and the Virginia delegate was nominated for this position. Thus, on June 15, George Washington received the duty to command and lead the army to independence. Washington reluctantly accepted, declaring, "With the utmost sincerity, I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with." He immediately took steps to organize the militia regiments, who were mostly civilians, and turn them into an effective fighting force. He also raided British arsenals for gunpowder, cannons and heavy artillery because the Continental Army was dangerously ill-equipped. Washington resisted repeated calls from Congress to launch attacks against the British in Boston, knowing the cost such attacks would have. When he finally had everything he needed, he ordered the fortification of Boston's surroundings, which forced the British to finally give up after nearly 11 months. Up until a certain point, there was a chance, albeit slim, that the conflict could have been resolved peacefully. After all, the Americans repeatedly sent petitions to abolish repressive laws and appoint their representatives to the Parliament. But that all changed on July 4th, 1776. On that day, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in the former colony of Pennsylvania and officially broke away from Britain by adopting the United States Declaration of Independence. The declaration explained why the 13 colonies were at war with the Kingdom of Great Britain and stated that from that day onward they regarded themselves as 13 independent sovereign states. These 13 states that laid the foundation of the United States of America were New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. It was the so-called Committee of Five who had drafted the declaration, made up of John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson, the latter being the composer of the original draft of the document. Some of the paragraphs of the declaration have become famous and inspiring throughout the world, especially its preamble. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute a new government. While the Declaration of Independence was a major milestone, it did not end the war, not by a long shot. The fightings raged on for years. Victories and losses were recorded on both sides, and in many instances, the fightings turned into a war of attrition, wearing each other down with heavy losses and lack of resources. Congress had three choices: making peace on British terms, continuing the struggle on their own, or complete independence, but with a catch: an alliance with France. France was already seeking to weaken Britain, but the Americans were fearing they were going to exchange one tyrannic empire to another. On the other hand, while supporting any move to make Britain's goals hard to obtain, France also wanted to secure the French West Indies from American expansion. The reasons were simple. Just one of those small Caribbean islands, Saint-Domingue, generated more profit from sugar and coffee than all American exports combined. On February 6, 1778, France and the United States signed the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, regulating trade between the two countries, followed by a defensive military alliance against Britain. In return for French guarantees of American independence, Congress agreed to defend their interests in the West Indies. Spain and the Dutch Republic later also supported the American cause. But even so, the war continued for another 5 years. In October 1781, the British suffered their last major defeat, after which an armistice was signed. The war officially ended on September 3, 1783, when the Treaty of Paris was signed and Britain acknowledged the United States' existence as a free, sovereign, and independent country. The victory of the Americans somewhat surprised the world. Even George Washington expressed astonishment that the Americans had won a war against a leading world power. This conflict had lasted over 8 years, from 1778 to 1783. The last uniformed British troops departed their last East Coast port cities in Savannah, Charleston, and New York City by November 25, 1783. That marked the end of British occupation in the United States. The western borders were laid on the Mississippi River, while in the northwest it was between the Mississippi and Ohio rivers and the Great Lakes. Now an independent country, the US had high hopes and aspirations, but also inherited a lot of problems, including slavery. George Washington was elected as the country's first president in 1789, and the 13 states agreed to cede their authority in matters of trade, warfare, and diplomacy to a central federal government. The Supreme Court was also established to interpret the law and defend the Constitution. They probably didn't even know it, but a new superpower was just born. The 13 former colonies didn't remain in their original form for long. Soon, the United States expanded, with new states like Ohio, Illinois, or Alabama being established. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson agreed to buy the territory of Louisiana from France, essentially doubling the country's size and extending it over the Mississippi and towards the west coast. But in 1812, the US and Britain were at it again. They were once more at war with each other. At that time, the British regularly seized American ships and forced those on board to fight in their war with France. The US declared war, tried but failed to seize Canada, and officially ended the conflict in essentially a territorial status quo. Still, this once again showed that this country is a new force to be reckoned with. Unfortunately, the issue of slavery within the US was more than just a philosophical debate, and in 1861, 7 southern states broke off to form the Confederate States of America, and once again, war broke out in North America. But let's leave that story for another time. I hope this video was interesting enough to have inspired you to look into it further on your own. If you liked it, leave a like and subscribe. You can leave your comments downstairs, and you can also check out my Patreon page if you want to support me. The link is in the description. I hope to see you next time. Bye.